Hey everyone, it's Andrew Nagel of Alkanine Designs, and I'm back with the next part of the Start to Finish Hybrid series. Here we are going to be adding the wire details to the inner portion of this frame that we made in the last video. I have been bringing this together with sheet metal and with some half-round wire, and now we are ready to start adding the innermost wire details to this piece. Starting with a length of 21 gauge square, I'm just kind of sizing out the length of wire that I'm going to be needing for this intersection and shaping it around the bezel. After I get the appropriate shape and size, I'll end up cutting off my extras, and then we'll be forming this into that center portion that you see where it sits rather nicely. So we're ready to start adding some 30 gauge wire, so that way we can start incorporating this other length of 21 gauge square into the design. Starting with my left side of the half round wire that is fused to this frame, I'm going to start attaching my 30 gauge wire. This will be soldered to the frame later, but for now we're just going to be twisting this up this length of half round wire until we're about a centimeter up the length of wire. And once you start determining that there's enough room to be able to fit your length of wire in there, once you have the right size and shape, you're ready to start adding that in there with the 30 gauge wire that we've been using. I'm going to basically weave this back and forth between this wire and then that innermost square wire. As you can see here, I'm setting that into place and then pulling the silver 30 gauge wire around that square wire to help pull it into place there. I'm going to start now building kind of a spiral weave detail, one of the opening kind of web weaves that we've done before. I'm going to be wrapping this twice around the outermost wire, then once around the innermost, then I'm going to go out to 3 times around the outermost wire, then once again around the innermost, then 4 times around the outermost, then 1 time around the innermost, 5 times around the outermost, 1 times around the innermost, and that progression of 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 on the outermost is going to make that outermost detail kind of fan open and create a kind of webbed effect as this 30 gauge wraps up to the tube setting that we have set in the middle of this design. So again, I'm just going to be wrapping that more around the outermost and then only once around the innermost, and then back up once more around the outermost and then only once around the innermost. I've done a couple of tutorials on this spiral weave detail, I like to call it, or the, fanning open weave detail. I also call it a web weave detail. I've done a tutorial specifically on it called web weave, so if you're needing to look this up, you can look it up in the search post bars. It's pretty easy. It's just basically an X-weave progression with more times around the outermost wire than the innermost, which creates that fan open effect that you see there. So now that this is attached, we're ready to start bringing this 30 gauge more up towards the top. I'm going to attach this again to my leftmost 13 gauge half round wire, and then I'm going to start tying off this web weave by circulating that silver wire around the half round wire until I've gotten 3 or 4 sections of height added to that, and I'm able to thus bring this wire over and connect it to my other side on top of this tube setting. I'm going to be bringing that wire down, and then I'm ultimately going to be pulling it up and shaping it to attach to this innermost square wire. As you can see, because of that web weave detail we did on the other side, this wire is pretty secure in here. You don't want to pull on this too hard because it could come out of that weaving, since we have not done the weaving on the other side yet. We're going to lock this into place. As you can see, this is not done with solder. This is going to be basically a free floating wire, but it is going to be held in place and stable with the 30 gauge round wire that we are using to attach these together. So here we're going to be building another web weave. The only difference is that we're going to have to be feeding this 30 gauge tip through underneath that 21 gauge and then up and out to thus connect these wires together. So I'm starting with my 30 gauge pulled over to my right side, and I am using the 30 gauge to wrap around the outermost right side 13 gauge half round wire. After I've done a couple of sections along that 13 gauge, I am then going to send my 30 gauge tip over and under and then up and out beyond that 21 gauge square wire. I'm only going to be doing this once through for the first couple of times, but eventually I will be using this wire and wrapping a full time around that innermost bar before I bring it back out. But basically this is going to be a spiral weave detail. We're going to start with the 30 gauge on the right side, and then I'm going to take that tip, fold it under that square wire, and then pull it up. And then I'm going to fold it under again and pull it back up, thus wrapping it around that wire one whole circular time, then bringing that back over and doing twice over on the outermost, then once again on the innermost, 3 on the outermost, once again on the innermost, 4 on the outermost, and then progressing up through to the other half round wire. Again, you're just building a spiral weave detail on this side to help secure that 21 gauge square wire that's kind of free floating in the center there in place. We're going to thus bring that 30 gauge up, and once we've gotten it up high enough that we can connect it to our other 13 gauge wire, I'm going to use just a simple X-weave detail just to bring these together. And what I mean by X-weave is you're just using that 30 gauge, wrapping it once around the outer side, crossing it over, which is where I get the X part, crossing it over to the innermost half round wire, connecting it again, then back over to the outermost, and just doing a simple X-weave progression on this side until I've gotten those 2 wires securely held together with the 30 gauge. And now I'm wrapping around the innermost wire, so now I can start to build the X-weave detail between this outer left wire and this innermost wire. I'm just going to wrap once around each side and then bring that wire back over to the other side. Actually, I wrapped 3 times around this innermost wire. This will be kind of a reverse progression, so I'm going to be going from the outermost to the innermost and then doing innermost to the outermost with a progression reducing. So I did 3 times on the first wraparound, then I'm going to do twice around that innermost, and then I'll go down to 1, thus creating kind of a reverse opening weave detail, while I'm also building a opening detail in between that middle and outer right half round wire. I'm wanting these to kind of fan open with my X-weave details here. So as I'm progressing up this innermost, I'm using like 3 times around, then going once over to the outermost, then 4 times on the innermost, once on the outermost, 5 times on the innermost, then once on the outermost. Just building another spiral weave detail. You'll see these a lot in my work. I really like how the X-weave kind of fans open and allows for kind of a webbed look in a curved space. So now I'm taking that 30 gauge and finishing this off. I am going to make another kind of spiraling open detail on the innermost and outermost wire here, just using that 30 gauge to tie these all together. Bringing that wire back over and then to the outermost. I'll be using this extra length of 30 gauge here to help build up a top portion that is also connected with a 21 gauge square to that inner portion right above the tube setting. I'm going to curve back my half round wires and cut off the extras where I want to attach those to the frame. So as you can see, those points are going to come down, and I'll just solder those directly to the frame to secure everything into place. Curving that back over, attaching those points down to where I want them to connect to the frame, and those parts are pretty much ready to rock and roll. The last thing we're going to be doing is adding another length of 21 gauge square to the top portion of that tube setting, and then using that 21 gauge square to come up and kind of bolster and thicken our upper part where the pendant will hang from the bail. Making sure all that 30 gauge is pushed down and nice and secure. We're going to be ready for our last wire detail here, which will be another length of 21 gauge square that is attached to the upper portion of that tube setting. So now I've done a little spiral swoop with the 21 gauge, and I built that swirl before I added it to the piece, and then I've used the 30 gauge to connect between the 21 gauge and also the 13 gauge half round wire. I've taken that little point of the 21 gauge that would protrude into that web, and I curved it back with my pliers. I just wasn't recording when I did this. I did a little X-weave pattern to help lock in this 21 gauge, and as you can see, the curve of the 21 gauge curves along with the topper curve of the 13 gauge half round wire. I'm also going to be cutting off my 30 gauge here since I've connected these two pieces with the X-weave. You can see the little bit of detailing on my middle finger there. These are now held together, and as you see, I just bent down that 30 gauge. Don't worry, I'm not going to just leave it there. That will get soldered to that half round wire when I solder the back portions together. I'm also going to be soldering the tip of this 21 gauge that we just added, that swirl that's right above the tube. I'm going to be soldering that to the 30 gauge wire. I'm going to be using a little tiny portion of flux and just a little bit of heat, fusing them all together to make sure all those wires are absolutely secure, and thus making this a fully fabricated design. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed this portion of the tutorial. The next portion we're going to be building the bail, and then I will be bringing this all together. I hope you have a great week, everyone, and stay creative out there.